So let's talk about breeding considerations. Learning objectives. Define pedigree. Define outcrossing, inbreeding, line breeding, crossbreeding, and designer dog. Discuss factors to consider before selecting breeding dogs, bitches and stud dogs. And describe a non-breeding contract. Pedigree. This is the written records of a dog's breeding. A pedigreed dog is a purebred with a recorded lineage, i.e., the ancestors are recorded. The ancestry is recorded by the major registry. Example, in Canada, the Canadian Kennel Club, or in the States, the American Kennel Club. And you can see here on the pedigree document that it has the parents of the animal and then, of course, its lineage as it goes down the line as well. So we're looking at breeding. We have pedigree breeding, which involves either outcrossing, line breeding, or inbreeding, which is not ideal. Non-pedigree breeding has crossbreeding, like designer dogs, and backyard breeding, indiscriminate breeding. And we'll talk about all of those in a little bit more detail. When we're talking about pedigree dogs, what we're talking about is specifically getting an outcome that matches the purebred standards for that specific breed. So line breeding, many breeders use line breeding. It's done within the family or pedigree lines, i.e. the extended family. Preferably, this isn't done within a 5-generation pedigree. So what we're saying here is, yes, these dogs are being inbred. So there's a lot of debate right now about the terminology around inbreeding versus line breeding, and essentially it's the same thing. However, we have to remember that even humans came from one genetic pool at one time. So in order to maintain specific purebred traits, it's typically accepted that these purebred animals will be line bred at some point, which means an ancestor of their own in their own lineage is bred back into the family. Now, like I said below here, preferably this doesn't happen within a 5-generation degree or a pedigree. So when we have inbreeding, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I believe, but inbreeding is when we're talking loosely about brothers and sisters mating or mothers and sons mating, essentially what we would consider incestuous as humans. So when we start getting really tight, close genetic pools, such as mother and son, or offspring, immediate siblings, the genetic pool gets very, very, very small. And with that, any hereditary abnormalities are compounded and are almost guaranteed to show up in those pups, in those offspring. When we consider line breeding, which in all, it's a little bit more of a exclusive way. I don't want to say exclusive way, but it's a little bit more of an exclusive term for inbreeding, because the considerations within line breeding, when we talk about having a 5-generation pedigree between breedings, that means that that genetic pool is getting a little bit larger throughout those 5 generations. And then when those technically family members are bred back together, they have a large enough genetic pool that we typically don't see a lot of that genetic abnormalities recreating themselves in the offspring. So of course there are problems with that. In general, we have to look at the difference between pedigree, so the difference in generations of pedigree when we are deciding to line breed our animals. So is it a very, very close pedigree? Are they closely generationally linked, i.e. is it siblings? Or are we looking at great, 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 great grandmother puppy to the offspring? But definitely things to consider, because any genetic abnormalities will likely be compounded the closer the generations are between breedings. Outcrossing is breeding when you breed your dog outside of its extended family. So this is a brand new bitch and a brand new stud. They are not related in any way or form. This may be a good way of enlarging the gene pool, and it has that hybrid vigor. So essentially, the more diverse the gene pool, the less likely we are to see those repeated genetic abnormalities. Some breeders frown on this method and prefer line breeding. What do you think? What are your thoughts on it? What are the considerations, ethical considerations, and physical considerations when we're looking at outcrossing compared to line breeding? And then inbreeding, like I mentioned before, that's when you breed within the immediate family or pedigree. So essentially, inbreeding is never recommended and it's never really accepted as far as I know. It's typically brother and sister that are meeting together, or the bitch and the offspring are meeting together. And quite often it's accidental, I would hope, and it's not recommended to maintain that litter because, again, any genetic pooling or any genetic abnormalities are just going to be compounded because that genetic link is just too close. So now what we're finding is this crossbreeding of animals, and it's becoming quite challenging. There's a lot of ethical debate around crossbreeding. So it's just crossbreeding different breeds of dogs, and we get this with cats too, but dogs in particular is what we're talking about. So we've got the Pomchi, that's a Pomeranian and Chihuahua. We've got the Puggle, which is a pug and a beagle. A golden doodle is a golden retriever and a poodle, labradoodle, shih poo, husky-mute, cockalier, cavapoo, yorkie poo. So all these, in my personal opinion, ridiculous breedings, and we often call them designer dogs. And unfortunately, what's happening with these designer dogs is we're not getting the type of genetic testing or the type of physical or veterinary testing that a typical pedigreed breeder would undergo for their dogs, for a purebred dog, and instead we're getting breedings of opportunity because people are willing to buy into this, don't forget. So when we get on to Kijiji, of course, or breeders who may not be registered breeders, we start seeing these, quote, designer breeds for sale. And they're for sale anywhere from about $700 upwards of $2,000. And we have to remember that the same amount of research, the same amount of work, the same amount of trials and time haven't gone into the breeding of these dogs that have for a lot of purebred registered breeder dogs. So it's something to consider. Are there advantages to crossbreeding, and are there disadvantages? So advantages, of course, if you can capture the strengths of both breeds and breed them into one particular dog, then you can end up with a hardier breed of dog, most definitely. However, the disadvantages, we start getting into some of these challenges, especially with whelping when it comes to actually parturition, so the birthing process. When we're matching up dogs that don't suit each other in size, sometimes what we end up with is, let's say, a Boston Terrier bitch who's been bred with a beagle or has been bred with a large poodle. And these poor dogs, when it comes time for parturition, for whelping, so for birth, they can't actually give birth to these giant puppies. Their little pelvic canals and their vaginal canals are just too small. So of course it can create major challenges with the birthing procedure, and of course that would end up in a C-section, which is traumatic for the dog. And also, too, we have to look at what traits we're breeding into these dogs. So are we breeding to create a hardier dog that's also hypoallergenic or doesn't shed? Okay, that's not a bad idea. But on the other hand, are we breeding a normal dog with a brachycephalic dog just to get a normal dog size with a really smushed in brachycephalic face? Because we've talked about brachycephalic dogs, we know that that is not an ideal trait for a dog, as their respiratory system is impacted, their ability to breathe and cope with weather changes is severely impacted. So there's definitely ethical considerations that a breeder, and especially a responsible breeder, will look into before making their choices in crossbreeding and creating these designer breeds. And buyer beware. If you are looking for a dog, we'll talk about selecting the right breeder, but buyer beware anytime you see names like shih poo, labradoodle, husky-mute, cockalier, cavapoo, because again, these are all generally newer dogs. And the research, the breeding repetition just isn't there to substantiate. So then we have this sad case, backyard breeding or indiscriminate breeding. These are not a very reliable or ethical way to produce animals. Puppy mills use this type of breeding. Ethical breeding aims for healthy offspring and avoid breeding dogs with known inherited defects. So essentially, the ethics go out the door when we're talking about backyard breeding, indiscriminate breeding, and this can apply to all sorts of situations. Unfortunately, we've found out in recent years in North America that, sorry, my phone keeps going off. Recent years in North America, that a lot of pet stores are using puppy mills to supply their pet stores with puppies and with kittens and puppy mills. And what's happening with these puppy mills is that these dogs, or kitty mills for cats, but these dogs are being mass produced. So they're literally, the adult dog is being bred. So it's being forced to be bred at certain intervals in its estrus phase. And then they're kept in a cage or in a very small room with very poor living conditions, very poor environmental enrichment, if any at all, and very poor health care. So these animals are legitimately kept in a cage, forced to be bred. They have their puppies. We see the puppies in the pet store. We think they're the cutest thing ever. And we don't even think about looking at where these puppies came from. Because now we've got a puppy in front of us. It's cute. Let's buy it. Let's go. But in reality, there's a lot of dogs that are suffering because of this mentality. So again, buyer beware, really look into the source that you're getting your dog from. I recently had a client tell me all about their new German Shepherd puppy that they were told to them on Kijiji it was a home-raised dog, both parents present. They had pictures of these apparent parents of this puppy, and when they went to pick up the dog, the breeder wouldn't meet them at their home, so they wouldn't introduce the new owner to the parents. Instead, they met them at like a Tim Hortons or something, handed the puppy off to them. Puppy smelled like a barn, so this puppy was clearly in, definitely in a barn, raised in a barn, and it's very likely that it was part of sort of a mass-produced puppy. We have a lot of issues with that in Ontario as well right now, with people raising puppies and having breeding dogs in barns, and they just have mass amounts of dogs being raised in barns and bred in barns, and it's really a sad state for animals. So puppy mills, backyard breeding, indiscriminate breeding, always keep an eye out for this. Sometimes if the story's too good to be true, and if the owner is not willing to let you sort of see the situation where the dog was bred, meet the parents, then you might be looking at a secret backyard breeding or puppy mill. Always beware. So breeding considerations, both the stud and the bitch must have a good temperament. How would this be determined and what are you looking for? So temperament, we're looking for an openness to play, an openness to approach people, not running up to people and growling. You're not coming into a room and seeing the parents have the whites of their eyes showing, giving you shifty eye. So really open, friendly, tail wagging behavior. Both parents must be healthy and free of inherited disorders or diseases. How would we ensure that the parents are healthy? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Are we going to bring our vet with us to this visit? Not necessarily. But we can look for things like signs of fleas, so we can comb through their coat. The mom and dad dog should not have fleas if they've been treated regularly, and I'm talking properly treated with veterinary medication. So we can comb through their hair. That's something gentle that's easily done. Looking for signs of fleas, and that looks like coffee grinds in their hair. We can also look at their muscling, make sure that they're well muscled and symmetrical muscling throughout their body. We can have a look at their nails, make sure that the owners are taking care of their nails, taking care of their basic needs, trimming their nails. We want to make sure that there's no eye goo, major eye infections, anything like that, and just the overall coat and condition of the animal. If they're kept in good condition, they should have a nice thick coat, nice shiny coat. Can you think of some inherited problems in dogs? There are tons of inherited problems in dogs, and we'll talk about this in class. But we have all sorts of diseases. We have heart disease, there's hip dysplasia, there's challenges with cruciate ligaments, luxating patellas, eye disease, poor set eyes in the eye socket, all sorts of inherited diseases that can go on. So it's always good to talk to the owners of these dogs of the stud and the bitch dog and to ask about any congenital or inherited diseases that they've come across, and any diseases in general, finding out what they are, and then you doing your own research to find out if they're inherited. How would we know whether the parents have inherited defects? Sometimes we don't. The best thing you can do is have a good look at the animal, watch them walk, watch for signs of inappropriate gait, inappropriate posturing, and then have a thorough look over the dog. I would definitely ask the owner for, anything that they can list off that was a disease. And it's not a bad idea. A lot of really good, reputable breeders will often offer the medical records as well, or a note from their veterinarian confirming that there's no genetic diseases going on in the parents. So that's something to consider if you are looking at purchasing a bred dog. And then consider whether you are inbreeding, line breeding, outcrossing, or crossbreeding for purebred breeding. And that's something to look at and ask about if you're acquiring a bred dog. So visit the kennel where the breeding will take place. So this is either if you are having your dog as a breeding bitch or if you are looking to purchase a dog. Always visit the kennel where the breeding will take place. Get an idea. As soon as you walk in, you'll be able to smell if there's anything abnormal or awry. Kennels shouldn't smell like diarrhea. There's no excuse for kennels to smell like diarrhea. A well taken care of kennel should have little smell, definitely little smell. I mean, some animals definitely soil in their houses, but it should be cleaned up right away in a high-end, health-conscious kennel. Breeding must be witnessed, so this is something that you'd want to confirm with either the stud owner or the bitch owner, depending on who you are owner of. And artificial insemination is an alternative. So if the two dogs, if their personalities don't match up, or if there's any other physical reason that they're unable to breed together, then artificial insemination is definitely an option as well. So when you purchase an animal from a breeder, if it's a Canadian Kennel Club or American Kennel Club registered breeder, what they'll often provide to you is a non-breeding contract. So this is a contract provided by the breeder to the new owner. It accompanies the registration application and change of ownership. Papers from the CKC will indicate NB after the animal's registration number, and that NB is indicative of a non-breeding contract. Dogs can show and participate in any events that require a registration number, even though they have this non-breeding contract. So why would you want to show a dog if you're not planning to breed your dog? Because a lot of people will go into the show circuit to get buyers for the breeding of their bitch or of their sire. So when we talk about that, we'll come back to that question actually. So why would you sign a non-breeding contract if you're purchasing a dog from a breeder? This is a responsible method of selling puppies. Some breeders actually spay and neuter their puppies before they are sold, therefore the contract's not needed. And you tell the breeder up front that you want a dog for breeding purposes or you don't want a dog for breeding purposes. If you'd like a dog for breeding purposes, the breeder can reserve the best candidate for your purposes. So essentially the main goal of a non-breeding contract is more or less an honor system that owner of the dog is going to be a responsible owner and not breed the dog. Because again as well, if the breeder is trying to protect the lineage of the dog and to protect that pedigree of the dog and of their lines, they don't want anybody who purchases a dog from them to just start breeding it with any dog and every dog in the world just because they can. So that also protects their lines as well. So lifting the contract, this is possible. When the dog is mature, the owner can take the dog back to the breeder to ensure that the dog is not carrying any visible hereditary faults. And so a benefit of showing your dog, even if you don't want to breed your dog, the benefit of showing your dog, so having your dog attend dog shows, allows the judge to inform you of any disqualifying faults. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, as long as you don't take it too personally, if you're not planning to breed the dog, then it's just fine, and every animal is unique, just like us. But if you are planning to breed the dog, then that judge can give you a little bit more information about any potential disqualifying features. And that being said, they might be able to give you a little bit of insight into any of those faults that might be hereditary or passed on. So at this point, when you bring the dog back to the breeder could lift the non-breeding agreement, and you would be able to breed your dog and register its puppies. So this is all done, it's a whole process, and it's all contractually obligated by the breeder. So ahead of time, you come up with a decision with the breeder. Either they make it an option for you to come back and ask for the non-breeding status to be lifted, or they have it in their contract that this is a non-breeding dog and they require you to spay or neuter their dog. Overall, if you are bringing the dog back to have the non-breeding status lifted, of course, there's typically a fee for the paperwork, and it's a nominal fee. Responsibilities of the owner of the bitch. So if you are owning a breeding bitch, you would notify the owner of the stud as soon as the litter is born and send litter registration forms to the stud. Well, to the stud's owners, of course. You'd register the litter with the CKC, so the Canadian Kennel Club, and when the litter is sold, you'd register, identify, and transfer each puppy ownership. In this case, if this is your dog and you are the owner of the bitch, then you would be the one to prepare a non-breeding agreement and give a guarantee of soundness of health. So all of this are obligations if you are a registered and responsible breeder as part of the Canadian Kennel Club or the American Kennel Club, and it's all contracts that go in place to help protect the breeding of the dog and to help protect responsible pet ownership as well. This is a typical Canadian Kennel Club registration certificate. And sample nose prints that help identify each individual nose print for the dog. So the nose prints on the left are acceptable nose prints, and the samples on the right are common unacceptable nose prints. So we've got excessive moisture, it's too light, incomplete, smudged, and wet, excessive ink, and inconsistent pressure. So there's quite a technique that goes into creating these essentially fingerprints but nose prints for the dogs as part of registration. There are other options as well, and we've talked about this in class before, but alternatives to breeding. So of course there are definitely purebred animal rescues throughout Ontario and throughout Canada as well. These are my preference. You guys probably know that by now, that I'm slightly biased and that I like to give animals homes who need homes instead of reproducing more to introduce into the world. And that's mainly just because of my experience, and I've been able to see the overpopulation that's happening. So one thing, my dog, my old dog Leia, she was the Great Pyrenees. She was a bred dog. She was a purebred dog, and essentially, I guess she was sold originally as a puppy for about $2,000, I believe the puppies went for. But the breeder, I really liked her. She was a responsible breeder, and she worked with a local veterinarian as part of a rescue for Great Pyrenees dogs. And it was really amazing. So what would happen is dogs who were from this breeder, if the owner at any point in their life was considering giving up the dog and needed to find a home for the dog, then they were contractually obligated to email, call, get in touch with the breeder. The breeder, no questions asked, would take the dog back into her home and integrate it into this rescue. So then the breeder is working with the local veterinarian to find new suitable homes for her purebred Great Pyrenees, and they would filter through owners to ensure that the best owners were able to adopt these dogs out. So we acquired Leia from this breeder, but technically from the rescue, and I think we had to pay a nominal fee. It was a few $100s or so, and that money is integrated into the rescue side with a charitable donation receipt attached to it, and that allows her to take in these dogs again and get them spayed and neutered, get them set up with veterinary care, and then to put in the effort to find homes. So that's my preferred method if you are interested in getting a purebred dog. Of course, Downfalls of that, sometimes if it's not the breeder that takes them back and it's simply a rescue that takes them in, we may not know the lineage. It would depend on what the current owner is willing to pass along. But again, depending what you're looking for, you might find your perfect option suited in your purebred rescued society. Otherwise, if you're looking for a purebred dog, definitely stick to some of the pointers that were outlined in this PowerPoint, because we have to be very cautious of those puppy mills that creep up. And puppy mills, I find, now have a new face to them. It's typical now that we see them as Kijiji dogs, or just in general any sort of social media dog for sale. Have to be cautious of the lineage of that specific dog. So we'll end it on this note for the day, evening, whenever you might be listening to this. And just having a look at my pictures with Leia there, you can see I took a lot of selfies with that dog. She was one marvelous pooch. We were very lucky to have her. She came with her issues, but she was a darn good dog. And unfortunately, this last picture here was our very last day. So with that, I'd like to say, hug your dog. And do consider all these things when either breeding your dog or attending a breeder to purchase a dog. But remember, they don't last forever, so go hug your dog.